Okay, well, welcome back. I'm John Hart. Welcome back to Mr. America Hart. This is an interesting video today because I started to think about this, between takes of some other videos. We've had some decades-long eras, let's say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and they're actually named for eras of bodybuilders. And I'll flash across the screen here a few of the guys from different eras, but I want to concentrate basically on, yes, men's bodybuilding, going through certain eras from the 50s up until now and seeing which look is it that we like the most. At the time, the Mr. America, Mr. Universe, we had people like Steve Reeves and George Eiferman. I'm just thinking of names off the top of my head. Guys like that represented the time period. The physiques that they had were phenomenal, for what was there at the time and what they did. There was no real concentration on getting super, super ripped. That era had not come up yet. So we're talking about basically some pretty healthy people, that lifted weights, built their bodies up. And, unless they were involved in other things like smoking cigarettes at the time, back then it seemed pretty popular, but I'm not sure with the bodybuilders it was so much. But in bodybuilding terms, those bodybuilders of that era, they had a really nice look and they had a decent amount of body fat on them too, even when they competed. That's one thing that I did notice, is that they did have a higher level of body fat on them. So aesthetic physiques, pretty much the shape they were born with, slightly larger, and they had different looking physiques. Each one of them, you could define the look of their body. I just named two, as representative of what I think. Steve Reeves was the ultimate in aesthetics and shape, and then George Eiferman, a little bit more stocky and not quite. Moving on into the 60s, representative, in that era, there's really, as we come into the 60s, people like Chris Dickerson popped up, the first black Mr. America. People like Boyer Coe popped up, Mr. America. Dennis Tinerino, Mr. America. I can name them off the top of my head nonstop. It became an era of Larry Scott, the first Mr. Olympia. Sergio Oliva had come out at that point in time. Sergio had a physique that was just at that point in time, unseen before. Small waist, giant arms, lats, thighs, massive. And still, the body fat was still there. They would come down to a decent amount of definition. And, I would categorize them still as being healthy. Yes, still being healthy on contest day, let's say. Obviously, an introduction of steroids. Larry Scott on record as having Diana Ball. Diana Ball in the 60s was really hitting some of the physiques. So you could see a definite difference in some of the physiques at the time, getting bigger. They got much bigger than the guys in the 50s, much bigger. And Diana Ball was the drug of choice at the time in bodybuilding. First really bodybuilding used steroid, PED, if you will, whatever you want to call it. Moving on into the 70s. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Arnold stepped into it right around 1969, 1970 on the national and the world scene. And Arnold changed everything. He brought not just the personality, but we're sticking to physiques talk right now. He brought a hugeness as far as that physique goes. He took down Sergio Oliva. Sergio Oliva continued to get bigger and bigger right into the early 70s. He grew quite a bit. And he also gained more definition. His body fat became lower each year he competed in the first half of the 1970s. Arnold, too, showed up a little smooth, let's say, with a little bit of body fat. But as the early 70s went on, 71, 72, 73, 74, Arnold in 1974, which I think was his best year, he was amazing. Arnold was the example at the time. The example. His physique was massive. And this is before the general public was kind of hip to the idea that, these guys were using drugs and using steroids at the time to gain a lot of the mass, but also their lifestyle was training very hard for a large part of the year and concentrating on those titles. At that point, Joe Weider had Arnold on contract, and very few bodybuilders making an absolute living, out of this sport. And Arnold being one of them. So he was the example, I see, of the 70s at that point. As we got into the 80s, Lee Haney all the way. Lee Haney, the best of the best in the 1980s. 8-time Mr. Olympia from 1984 to 1991. And Lee Haney really dominated, and he had that look. There were a few Mr. Olympias before him that, transitioned from Frank Zane, but when Lee Haney came on the scene and he hit his peak in 1984, he just wiped him out and took over. So that look, the Lee Haney look, and some of the other bodybuilders of the time, I could mention them, Lee Labrada, Rich Gaspari, Barry DeMay, just to name a few. Those guys really stand out to me as having still an individual look about them. So each one of them, if you took their caricature and just put it up against the wall, the outline of their bodies, you could pick them out. And you could pretty much say who was who by the poses as well as by their physiques. Just standing there. You could pick out who was who. The different eras of bodybuilding, all since the 50s until now. Hope you enjoyed this video. And listen, before you go, off to your left, well, no, to your right, on my left, you're going to see a disc pop up. That is the subscribe button to my channel. If you're liking the videos that I'm doing, please give that thing a tap, and YouTube will let you know when I have new videos pop up. Down below, off to your left, you're going to see a thumbs up button over there. Won't you please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed any part of it or all of it, and share it with your friends and family. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next time. John Hart.